The Right Honourable Liz Truss is the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Now, since leaving office, she has remained a polarising figure on markets and economic policy, known for her clear and unapologetic views on how governments should approach growth. She joins us for a special discussion here at the World Government Summit. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Secretary Truss to the stage. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, I know you've flown in this morning, so thank you very much. What a pleasure to welcome you here at the World Government Summit. Now, lots of things to ask you today about where the world is sitting, but for a moment, let us quickly address the elephant in the room, because, of course, your leadership was, of course, defined by the rather disastrous mini-budget of 2022. We saw markets react not very well to that. So as we gather here today, and we have policymakers, government figures, leading CEOs in the room today. Tell me, Secretary Truss, why do you feel...
First of all, it's not Secretary.
Okay.
But the line that you are repeating is essentially a false narrative about what happened. And what actually happened was Britain's pension market had been very badly regulated. We had a lot of pension funds that were exposed to rises in interest rates. What was happening in 2022, as well as very high energy prices, we also had interest rates rising across the world, including in America, including Japan, and including in Europe. The reason that there was a spike in gilts in 2022, and the Bank of England later confirmed this in a report they issued in 2024, was because of the LDI crisis. And the night before we announced the mini-budget, which was a package of measures to get growth going in the British economy, the Bank of England announced the sale of £40 billion worth of gilts, which kind of set off a chain reaction. And what has happened subsequently, and in fact, the Wall Street Journal produced a documentary about this called The Prime Minister versus the Blob, and in which they described the British press as incurious and unserious. And I think we have a serious problem in Britain that our economic institutions have failed the country for the last 30 years. We've had economic stagnation, we've had quantitative easing, which led to a huge rise in asset prices. It's pushed young people out of the housing market, but the economic establishment does not want to acknowledge their failings. So they like to point the finger at me, but you can look at all the evidence about what's caused Britain's stagnation. The real reasons: high taxes, high regulations, some of the highest energy prices in the world thanks to not using our oil and gas reserves and instead pursuing net zero policies that have turned out to be economically suicidal. And you can conduct a comparison with the United States of America. So in the year 2000, British GDP per capita was almost the same as the United States of America. By the year 2025, their GDP is 50% higher per capita. Why is that? Well, their energy prices are a quarter what they are in the UK. So that doesn't just benefit traditional manufacturing industries, it also benefits industries like AI, like crypto, that are very energy intensive. So we have had a failing economic policy for a long time. I tried to change that in 2022 by getting rid of the windfall tax on oil and gas, by getting on with fracking, by not raising corporation tax. And one of the reasons there are so many British people in Dubai now is because our taxes are so high. And if you look at what has happened, and we've had the counterfactual of what has happened since the mini-budget wasn't implemented, and it wasn't implemented because there was essentially rebellion by the British economic institutions, every single metric has got worse. So gilt prices have been worse under this Labour government. Debt is higher, unemployment is higher, growth is lower. It's pretty hard to see what has improved as a result of implementing more of the same policies.
And I want to ask you your thoughts on net zero and the UK as a whole in just a moment. But first, let's talk a little bit about where we are in the world today. Start of 2026, as we come here together, of course, there's a number of geopolitical crises around the world. The war in Ukraine is still continuing. The crisis in Gaza still remains to be seen. And against the backdrop of this, we're also seeing tensions between the US and Iran, and the fact that governments are continuing to roll over large amounts of debt at high interest rates. We're seeing Japan, who's got snap elections later this week. So with your understanding of the world economy today, where would you say is the greatest economic risk that governments are still underestimating today?
Well, I would say it's a debt crisis. And we can see this in the UK. Our debt is almost 100% of GDP. We can see it in France. They are in very serious trouble. We can see it in the United States of America. We can see it in Japan, where, again, there is serious trouble. What is the problem? Well, basically, a lot of the Western economies, particularly Western Europe, have been living beyond their means. We have not been generating the economic growth. We have not been generating the productive capacity. Instead, we've been consuming, and we've grown in debt. And to me, the two people who are trying to take this on, actually there's three people who are trying to take this on. One is Donald Trump. He is trying to shift the American economy from consumption to production. He's trying to reindustrialize, reshore, and deal with the massive mistake of allowing China to essentially become the outsourced vehicle for American manufacturing. Javier Milei is again trying to outrun these factors in Argentina by radically cutting the size of the state and deregulating. And Sanai Takaichi is trying to take this on in Japan, which is a massive challenge. But what I was trying to do in 2022, and this is the challenge for elected politicians, is it's very, very difficult to cut the size of the state in the short term. First of all, because of the political pressure. And we can see the struggles Labour has had to deal with the welfare budget. It's also difficult to cut the size of government in the short term because you have to pay redundancy, you have to restructure. Anybody who runs a corporation understands that this is a process that takes time. So therefore, what you have to do is you have to try and ensure that the private sector is growing faster than the public sector. You essentially have to outrun the debt. And what do you need to do that? Well, you need growth to be higher. That's why things like reducing energy costs are so important. It's why low taxes are so important. It's why deregulating is so important. And the story of Britain and France is that we have done none of those things. That's the story.
And I want to ask you about energy in just a moment. But first, I want to pick up on what you were saying. I know you're a big proponent on your podcast of a Trump-style economic reset for the UK. But I have to say, when we look at America, you mentioned the growing debt. Of course, federal debt there is past $38 trillion. Consumer confidence is at its lowest level in the States for 10 years. Growth is slowing around 1.5%. There's policy uncertainty that's rattling markets as well. And of course, we've had the problems with tariffs as well, increasing the cost of goods for everyday people. Germany this week has spoken the fact about it feels that its alliances with trusted alliances like the US is also crumbling as well. Why should then countries copy an economic model that brings a lot of this chaos?
Well, what we've had up to now in the West is managed decline. It's a kind of acceptance that over time, the Western economies will be eclipsed by economies like China, which I think is the number one strategic threat to Western civilization. Trump is shaking that up. And in shaking that up, he is taking on the international institutions who have backed managed decline, who've backed Keynesian economics, who've backed things like DEI and net zero, which have actually damaged economic competitiveness. That's the reality. I mean, China is building coal-fired power stations. A lot of the agreements that have been reached have damaged Western economies. They've not damaged our competitors. So Trump is taking that head on. And of course, that creates what you describe as disruption, because he is trying to take on a failing economic system that is not working. And it's not just not working for Western economies as a whole, it's particularly not working for the working class and middle classes in our countries. If you look at the industrial decline that there is in states like Pennsylvania, which voted for Donald Trump as a result of Clinton allowing China to join the World Trade Organization on developing country terms and essentially outsourcing those jobs. So yes, any change is painful, and there's a hell of a load of vested interests in the current economic system. The central banks, the major banks, the financial system, and we've seen a financialization as well of the British economy and the US economy at the expense of areas like manufacturing. So of course those people are going to squeal. Of course they're going to call their friends at Bloomberg and complain about it. That's not a surprise, but was the policy really working? And I do challenge the growth numbers you've just quoted. I think the latest American growth numbers are more like 3 or 4%. I don't think they're 1%. I think you might be thinking about Western Europe. And British growth, I think the last one was 0.1%. And sometimes it's minus 0.1 and sometimes it's plus 0.1. But what we are seeing, Western Europe as a whole has declined relative to America, but also relative to economies that are growing around the world. And I include the United Arab Emirates on that list. And we've got to look seriously about what we've been doing wrong.
Well, let me pick up on what you were saying about China, because that's something you talk a lot about, very hawkish on China. You talk a lot about it in your podcast as well. We know Keir Starmer was in Beijing just days ago. I know you were calling him desperate, saying he is pulling at straws. But we know that British businesses are very tightly engaged with China. Of course, China responsible for around a fifth of global manufacturing. So in a world where China is this embedded in the global economy, is an economic decoupling, is that really realistic? What do you see as the real solution instead?
So I don't support economic decoupling. I think trade with China is important. What I do support, though, is we are careful about how we work with China. And we don't take their promises and blandishments at face value. And that was what was particularly ludicrous about the Keir Starmer visit. It didn't actually deliver much economic output, but the economic output it delivered is very, in my opinion, untrustworthy. And we've seen that through commitments on areas like climate change that haven't been followed through on. I support the development of what I describe as an economic NATO, where countries who share our values, who believe in freedom, free speech, free markets, democracy, work together to have a common policy towards China. I'm encouraged by Pax Silica, which the Trump administration has recently launched. Of course, the UAE and Britain are both members of Pax Silica, working together on critical minerals. That is more the sort of approach I would like to see of those countries who do not want to see a world dominated by China and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese control of critical minerals work together.
Because there's been quite a different strategy here in the UAE, isn't it? I know you feel that global trade bodies like the WTO matter less now, that we are moving more towards these smaller blocks you mentioned earlier. But of course, here in the UAE, it's been a very different strategy. It's continued to sign trade agreements all over the world, and it's clearly paying off. Recently, we heard the UAE's non-oil trade has passed $1 trillion. So tell me, why do you feel that narrowing trade relationships can actually give a country more leverage when economies like the UAE appear to be thriving by staying open and connected?
Well, I think I'm the government minister that signed more trade deals than anybody else in Britain's history. I signed over 60 trade deals post-Brexit to get Britain back on track, and many of those deals were actually better than the deals that the EU did, and I kicked off the trade deal with the GCC, for example, kicked off the trade deal with the CPTPP. So now Britain is part of the Pacific Trade Agreement. I support doing trade deals where it makes sense for Britain. just like Donald Trump supports doing trade deals where it makes sense for America. What we are moving away from is the universalist approach where everybody can have access to low tariffs regardless of their behavior. And what we've seen from China is we've seen state-owned industries using subsidies to undermine industries like the steel industry, for example. We've seen intellectual property theft. We've seen all kinds of bad industrial behavior. That is not true of countries that are in the CPTPP. It's not true of the Gulf states. So what I'm talking about is a trade strategy that is realistic about the geopolitical implications as well as the economic implications. And what is very, very dangerous is for countries to become dependent on China. And we saw how China behaved with Australia when Scott Morrison criticized their actions during COVID. There was a trade embargo placed. That is the kind of response you can expect if you do a trade deal with China.
Well, let me pivot slightly. Let's talk a little bit about net zero. This is something you've mentioned a few times. It's something you speak a lot about. I know you've called it an economic mistake. You feel the UK has really harmed itself by trying to target net zero when you say it contributes only about 1% of global emissions. I think its historically cumulative effect is a little bit higher than that. But on the flip side, we're feeling the effects of climate change already. We're seeing higher food prices, higher insurance rates. We're seeing natural climate change disasters all over the world. So I think there's a concern that if every country says our emissions are too small to matter and prioritizes domestic growth first, how do we shape a credible global approach to climate risk? And if it's not net zero, what do you see as the alternative?
Well, I see the biggest threat to the future of the world as the dominance of autocratic states like China, not climate change. I think that is a bigger threat. And that is what our policies should be more closely focused on. Britain has put more strict climate change legislation in place than virtually any other country in the world. What's been the result of that? The result of that is more goods are being produced in countries that don't follow those rules. So all we've done is outsourced carbon production. Meanwhile, industries like the car industry, industries like the steel industry in Britain are on their knees. The towns and cities that they support are in serious economic difficulty. And it's essentially been so that British politicians can go to international summits and boast that they're showing leadership. Well, wake up. Nobody is following. Donald Trump isn't following. China isn't following. India isn't following. And we are sitting in Britain on huge depositories of oil and gas, which we are not using. Meanwhile, we've got the highest energy prices in the developed world. And that is just not an economically sustainable strategy for Britain. I'm afraid the leadership of Britain over a series of governments, and I trace this right back to the Blair government in the 1990s, have preferred to worry about how they are perceived internationally than the condition and livelihood of British people who vote for them. And we're now in a situation where Keir Starmer is the most unpopular Prime Minister in British history. The entire political system is shaking up in Britain because people are so frustrated that they want to vote for a better life. They want to have a better job. They want to be able to afford things, and yet we've had economic stagnation for 30 years, which has been imposed by a political elite. That is the situation in Britain, and it's very, very desperate.
We're almost out of time. Let us turn to the future. A couple of minutes left. When we look at the future, I think there's by 2030, we're expected to see 170 million new jobs created globally as a result of the AI revolution. About 92 million jobs also going to be displaced as well. And it's fascinating to look at how concentrated that shift is. We're seeing companies like Nvidia worth $2 trillion. We've seen Netflix. They have a billion subscriber base with only a workforce of about 15,000. So where do you see the biggest economic opportunities being created next? And politically, how do governments manage that transition if growth no longer automatically means jobs?
Well, I think there is a huge opportunity. And despite all I've said, I'm optimistic about Britain because I think we are now getting to the point where people are having a real discussion about why things have gone wrong, why the country's stagnated, what we need to do to fix it. We do have massive reserves of energy we could use. We can invest in nuclear as well as oil and gas. That is very, very important to have affordable energy to power the AI revolution, to power the crypto revolution, but also to reindustrialize Britain and make sure we are able to produce steel, cars, engineering equipment, aerospace that we have traditionally been very good at. And I think it's a combination of those things that will provide the way that Britain can make our way in the world. And I'm a supporter of low tax zones. Free ports have been very successful here in the UAE. Those are the types of bold policies we need to create a new business environment in Britain because we have the fastest rate of millionaires leaving Britain of any country in the world. I pointed out that many of them are here in Dubai. I seem to meet more Brits here in Dubai sometimes than I do in Britain. And they are also moving to other parts of Europe. They're moving to America. We need to do something bold to attract those people back, to attract the businesses, and to make our country great and economically successful again.
Well, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, keeping us on our toes. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's give Ms. Truss a very big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.